by this phase of the planning, we have now our immediate response plan is being designed. And we have now to plan for all the operational arrangements that we need in place to be able to implement timely this immediate response. And some of you in the groups were already trying to plan for them. Like, for instance, the group working on surveys, they were already planning on, oh, I need my equipment. That's exactly what we are going to do now. So we're here in the proposed step-by-step approach to ERP. And a bit similar to what was done for step 3, mapping existing capacities, we are going to do that looking at the usual key areas: coordination, information management, assessment, and everything we need for response delivery, immediate response delivery. And during that step, we continue identifying gaps, anticipating on obstacles and constraints, and we translate them into preparedness actions, okay? To avoid anything to hinder the timely implementation of the immediate response. Okay, so here again, we are planning for all the necessary operational arrangements that need to be pre-agreed, and appreciate actions that can be done at preparedness, also to anticipate possible obstacles. I just said this. So you do that step where once you have your response designed, right? And you can build upon the mapping of capacities that was done during step 3. For instance, step 3, you mapped your partners, you know who is doing what, where, when. But here, and it was coming out in some of your groups earlier, now you need to plan who is the partner who will scale up where and what intervention. You need to go a step further, okay? This step where you plan for all the operational arrangements can also be initiated during an ERP event with all your partners. You can do it collectively and maybe assign some colleagues to drive that step forward. So maybe it's a step where you have to closely work with, I don't know, colleagues from the supply division, someone who is working on supply chain management. Or maybe if you have you want to establish a file, a quick file that lists all your key essential supplies and equipment. You can ask an IM specialist to help you build that file. And again, we are really looking at the usual areas of our work. It's coordination, IM, assessment. And when it comes to response provision, it's knowing who will be your partners, scaling up what, where. For instance, we talked about nutrition surveys. It can be pre-agreed, you know, before the crisis hits, that you know who will be taking part of the multi-sectoral team that goes assess initial needs, you know, for a MIRA type of rapid initial assessment of needs. Don't lose time during the first week of the crisis onset to enter into negotiations with many partners to decide who will be part of that team. Pre-agree on this before. pre-agree on all the protocols you need to guide your response. For instance, you've heard about the simplified protocols for the management of acute malnutrition at times of emergencies. Don't start talking about those protocols once the crisis hits. As much as possible, make sure it's been discussed before, agreed with the government, that partners were trained. And same thing, supplies. We need to think ahead. Okay, how are we going to dispatch the supplies? Where will they be stored? The additional supplies, where will they be stored? Do we have plan B for transportation in case we face challenges with our usual transportation companies? There are so many things that need to be anticipated. Think of all the different tools you might need to do response monitoring. Maybe you will ask partners to report on a weekly basis instead of a monthly basis. Maybe the tools will need to be adjusted. Will you be able to cope with all the new needs, or do you anticipate you need additional surge personnel? Do you have a pool of trained personnel on NIE, on nutrition in emergencies, that could be engaged? Do you know about all the administrative procedures, accelerated administrative procedures? And do you know, or are your partners aware of all the funding mechanisms that will be triggered and made available when a big emergency hits? That's all the planning considerations that you take into account during that step. So again, for this, we really encourage you to, again, use the step-by-step guide. And there is a gap analysis tool that the GNC has. And we're gonna take a bit of time to, again, do the last group work of the day. And so basically, again, think we are all part of the nutrition cluster of Zwantipolis. We are building all together our ERP plan, and we are going to divide the tasks. Okay? So we will be using two different tools this time around. We have group 3, 4, and 5 who will be planning on all those operational arrangements on for the different areas they were already doing the response design. So group 3 is on smart survey, group 4 is on coordination in IM, and group 5 is scaling up the treatment of acute malnutrition. But now you're thinking, anticipating all the needs you have for personnel, TORs or SOP, guidelines, supplies, equipment, funding. And in the tool, in the Google Drive, you have this file called modified gap analysis tool. That's the file. So be careful, colleagues, because group 3, 4, and 5 are working on the same tool. And my co-facilitators, I didn't modify the tool, sorry. We need to pay attention that we are all working on the same tool. So don't write on top of each other, and try to brainstorm your HR guidelines, supplies, funding for your respective group. Okay? And group 1 and 2, you are going to focus on obstacles, on possible bottlenecks, constraints that could hinder the response. for IYCFE, group 1, and for micronutrients for group 2. And you're using a different tool that is also in the Google Drive. It's called Session 8, Group Work, Challenges and Gaps. I cannot see it.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to take 15 minutes for this. Again, I'm going to break you into different rooms as usual. Okay. So see you later, colleagues. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you very much, colleagues, for your respective planning and thinking going into those interesting exercises. Again, I found it quite interesting listening to some of your discussions. We're going to take a few minutes to hear from some of the groups. So we had groups working on the operational planning, operational arrangements, and groups working on anticipating constraints, the obstacles. So I think I'd like to ask group 4, if you don't mind, to share a little bit about the outcomes of your discussions. Group 4 was working on planning for coordination in IM. I know it's a French-speaking group, so restitution in English, if it's a challenge, maybe I will ask Denka or Ben, but if a participant feels like doing it, it would be great.
Cécile, we were trying to convince Roland to come up with the restitution. I don't know, Roland, if you feel comfortable. Please go ahead.
I'm not very comfortable in English, but I don't know. If I speak French, everybody can can't understand what I say. So, je peux parler français ou je parle
Oui.
mon anglais un peu plus ou moins acceptable. Vous me suivez?
Tu peux nous
Hein?
faire un petit
Oui.
résumé court en français et après Denka or Ben will do it in English.
Ok, d'accord. Donc, nous avons travaillé juste sur la partie coordination. Donc, on a pensé proposer la formation en tout cas de toutes les parties prenantes sur les principes de coordination pour la province A. Donc, nous avons prévu aussi la formation des partenaires sur les outils AM, donc un renforcement de capacité. Également, toujours dans le sens de renforcer les capacités des AM sur, en tout cas, pour la partie RH, les parties prenantes dans le cluster, puisque le village A où il y a ce déplacement vers le village, la province B plutôt, il va falloir installer ou créer un groupe de travail santé ou un cluster santé. Donc, c'est dans ce sens que il faudrait, d'une certaine manière, renforcer les capacités de ces personnes et voir comment préparer la rencontre, les invitations. Et ça prend vraiment un peu de temps. Dans les discussions, nous avons un peu évoqué ces aspects. Donc, c'est ce que j'ai retenu un peu pour la partie RH. Et nous avons également traité la partie guidelines. Je n'ai pas accès au clavier, donc je ne peux pas défiler. Si on peut me défiler la partie guidelines, ce que nous avons mis, on peut toutefois, voilà. Donc là, très bien, merci. Donc, les différentes, je vais dire, document qui existe, nous avons ajouté, je crois bien, côté, c'était quoi déjà nous avons ajouté? Je ne vois pas bien.
Je crois qu'on a ajouté les termes de
Termes de
référence.
référence.
Voilà, les termes de
Et
référence,
job
voilà. Très bien, les termes de référence et les différentes job descriptions ont été ajoutés. Donc, aussi, on a vérifié, on se disait que le current status, on vérifie si le document est à jour. Si ce n'est pas à jour, il faut faire sa mise à jour. Et donc, ce sont ces discussions qui étaient en cours quand on a coupé. Donc, si j'ai omis quelque chose, les autres collègues pourront ajouter. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Roland. Maybe Denka, you want to share in English for our colleagues. It was interesting to see in your group that you wanted to think how are we going to establish in Province B a nutrition cluster or a nutrition working group who will be coordinating for the emergency response.
Yes, we were, in fact, we were wondering whether we're in a situation in which the cluster exists or not. So we decided that, in fact, the cluster doesn't exist. And we would like to have, let's say, to train, first to establish a list and train the people on some principles on the coordination. We were also thinking that if one of the the immediate response activity that we mapped in the previous exercise is, for example, to map capacity, to work on some updates on data or secondary review. We will have to also prepare partners working in nutrition and health on some key principles on how or key tools that are existing. And so this training, quite a simple, might be also on something like a action to be there. I don't know what was the third thing, and I forgot what Roland was saying in French, but I believe that the terms of reference and the job descriptions are something that has to go in the HR tab from here. But we were discussing a lot on the fact that some when it comes to guideline, we could cross-check. I'll even use this tool and cross-check what is available, whether this is validated or approved by government, and so on. So we were thinking of, for example, whether the Rapid Smart is updated, whether the simplified protocols are approved for immediate use. So this kind of activities.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, colleagues. So, yeah, I think when we plan ahead for our coordination mechanisms and everything revolving around how we will do IM, information management, at even from the early phase of the crisis, I think there is a lot that can be done at preparedness phase. And you'll see when we do that ERP workshop together, you see that it's not really a place where we're going to start training our partners with the nutrition cluster coordination package or on humanitarian standards, or we are not going to enter into the details, the technical details of how are we doing IYCF in emergencies. So you need to plan for this to happen. So this is where during that step you think, okay, in that geographical location where I expect to have a crisis coming, I need to do pre-crisis as much as possible. Maybe a basic training on, humanitarian principles or what is the coordination, the cluster approach. Do it as much as possible before. as the colleague from Benin, Bonaventure, was explaining, as he's starting a little bit from scratch in the northern part of the country, how long it takes to start discussing with the local authorities there on who needs to step up to coordinate the emergency response and what it means to organize a coordination meeting, what will be the key agenda points. There are a lot of things that need to be pre-agreed, pre-arranged. Okay, and this is also during this ERP workshop, because we don't have the room at this stage to go into the details on how we do promote adequate early childhood development, or how we integrate it with IYCF. But you can realize at preparedness phase that there is a great deal of work that needs to be done on this particular area. And you can task a technical working group already working on IYCFE, for instance, to make sure that they are working on their preparedness more specifically, technically revolving around infant feeding in emergencies. Okay. Now, maybe we can take a few more minutes to hear actually from group 1, because they were working on anticipating constraints. That is also a very important thing to do at preparedness phase. And I think they were unpacking a lot of interesting obstacles. If there is someone from group 1 who wants to come in and share a little bit the outcomes of their discussion, if a participant feels like doing it in English, that would be great.
Oh, we didn't define somebody, but then yes, if my colleague are confident, please go ahead.
From group 1. I think you were unpacking a lot of interesting things on obstacles around communications, or how you build collaboration, and I would be really curious to hear from you, colleagues, on that.
No sé si están en línea.
Sí estamos, pero
vaya,
I can
María
try.
Claudia.
Yeah,
I can try.
just to read it.
I can try.
Claro.
Okay. Regarding coordination, we were discussing that a great obstacle is that we don't have often a communication, a fluid communication with civil society, for example. And then when the emergency comes, civil society organizations go their own way, and we have a lot of problems with infant and young child feeding because of that. And we need to have that communication before the emergency, and also the confidence building with the authorities, with local and not only local authorities, but with governmental authorities, can be a challenge. And it is very important to have them on board before, so the confidence can be built in a more how you say regular.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. In the information management, a great gap must be, we don't have tools to register practices in infant young child feeding and the actions, for example. And there we have a link with we must have a link with the food security cluster, because it is very important that infant and young child feeding is considered when there is a distribution of food. So we have to work on tools to register what is included in the food distribution, and to be sure that there is appropriate food for the young child feeding. We also have a lot of gaps in the knowledge. Sometimes we must know what are the practices in the affected areas and try to have that in mind. The lack of awareness of the infant and young child feeding is also very important, because it's something that we must work on a day-to-day basis, because there is not awareness of the importance of infant and young child feeding, even in some emergency partners. So, and really at all levels, emergency partners and civil society, and there is not awareness that it is very important to care for infant and young child feeding. Also, to have identified where we can have some secure storage is a gap. There is we must have a unique place to find where the supplies are, and also the educational materials to respond to an emergency, because sometimes we begin to think about, oh, we need this material to promote this and that, and we must have a place where all of that is storage. So we can make use of that very rapidly. And all the partners had some materials that we have already used, so we don't have to begin from zero. And another gap were the protocols. There are usually not protocols and training materials beforehand on emergency, and sometimes that is a very gap that take too much time, and we must have that also in the preparedness phase. And also the trained personnel. We have a gap in trained personnel on infant and young child feeding, and that is very much linked to the lack of awareness. But we have also the, for example, the donations of food, of the substitutes of breast milk is one of the most important challenges we always have in emergencies, and of acute onset and of chronic onset. So, and also the emergency staff from other agencies do not know very often the importance of infant and young child feeding, and that is a gap. And also it becomes an obstacle for the adequate response of the nutrition cluster. So I don't know if my colleagues have something else to add. I did it.
Thank you, Maria. This is great. Thank you so much. And yeah, you've outlined a lot of possible obstacles here, and this is really important when you have more time and when you go through such a thinking process with your partners to identify for each of those gaps a way to overcome that gap. And so start having your preparedness action, each gap being translated into a preparedness action. And this is how you're gonna little by little build a higher level of emergency preparedness, and how you're going to become more and more ready to actually respond timely and effectively to the next crisis. So really good job done from Group 1 as well, and everybody. I think you're really going through an interesting thinking process here, colleagues. So this is the end of our workshop today.